That's the principle of voluntary responsibility. If you make a voluntary decision that puts somebody else in harm's way, you are on the hook for getting them out of it. McMahon thinks that it is right for smokers to be denied lung transplants if there are other people waiting, and that we could extend that principle to other people as well. To a lot of people, that sounds reasonable at first, especially in the UK and the USA, where personal responsibility is a big tenet of political and economic philosophy. Yeah, if you get sick and it's your fault, then why should somebody else suffer just so you can get better? But here's the kicker. Smoking can be substituted for any medical condition that somebody develops as a result of making any voluntary choice. And lungs can be substituted for any medical resource, including money and time. If there are enough lungs for both you and Jemima, but only one surgeon, or only enough time in the day to do one operation, then Jemima gets them every time. And Jemima with her cystic fibrosis can be substituted for anybody with any medical condition that they develop through no choice of their own. If you need a lung transplant because of your smoking, but somebody else gets shot in the kidneys and requires a completely different kind of procedure, well still, you cannot get any treatment until they are completely fixed. That's a logical requirement. The principle of voluntary responsibility has no room for half measures and arbitrary decisions. This principle is so much more demanding than a lot of people realize. The philosopher Dan Wickler points out that if we really committed to this, we would deprioritize healthcare for every single case of sexually transmitted infection, every single case of AIDS, and every single pregnancy, except in cases of rape or infected blood transfusion. Because those are all cases in which somebody needs healthcare as a result of voluntarily choosing to have sex. So all the cystic fibrosis patients have to be seen first. Every attempted suicide who comes in would get left in the corridor. Maybe even stuff like food poisoning. You chose to eat shellfish rather than a veggie burger, you knew the risks. And again, when I say these would be deprioritized, I mean that funding for them would be entirely removed until every single non-voluntary healthcare condition was completely fixed. If you're pregnant, you cannot receive a single second or penny of medical attention until cancer is cured. If you believe in the principle of voluntary responsibility, that is what you are logically committed to. So things get pretty unrecognizable pretty fast if we start allocating healthcare based on who we think is responsible for their own condition. You might also be wondering, just on a practical level, how can we even tell to what degree somebody is responsible for the state of their health? And it's funny you should ask that, because part 2. Just on a practical level, how can we... Nobody ever seems to talk about applying the principle of voluntary responsibility consistently or completely. In the UK at least, it always seems to come down to smokers and fat people. So why? Well, part of the story is that it's to do with risk, especially if we're talking about surgery. All surgery carries an element of risk. It's the last legal blood sport in England, as a surgeon once told me. And if you are very fat or you smoke, that can correlate with other conditions that could mean surgery carries greater risks for you than it would for somebody who didn't have those other factors. The medical term for other factors like that is comorbidities. But that prompts the rather interesting question of how do we measure risk when it comes to allocating healthcare resources. A study in the journal Bioethics asked subjects to look at fictional patient files and decide who should get organ transplants in cases when there weren't enough organs to go around. The authors asked 283 people, which they admit is not a representative sample size of the public, to decide who should get a heart transplant between patients with or without histories of smoking, with or without histories of intravenous drug use, and with or without histories of eating high-fat diets against a doctor's recommendation. Subjects were significantly less willing to distribute organs to intravenous drug users than to cigarette smokers or people eating high-fat diets, even when intravenous drug users had better transplant outcomes than other patients. Subjects' allocation decisions were influenced by transplant prognosis, but not by whether the behaviour in question was causally responsible for the patient's organ failure. People's unwillingness to give scarce transplantable organs to patients with controversial behaviours cannot be explained totally on the basis of those behaviours either causing their primary organ failure or making them have worse transplant prognoses. Instead, many people believe that such patients are simply less worthy of scarce transplantable organs. It is not uncommon for people to argue in favour of allocating resources on the basis of personal responsibility. What our study shows is that these arguments may be convenient ways to support what otherwise merely reflect social desirability judgments. In other words, when human beings make decisions about who should get healthcare, we might be vulnerable to making those decisions based not on how much good could be achieved or on the risk, but on who we think is deserving. I say might be vulnerable because, in fairness, that is only one study and it has its limitations, like the sample size. It only investigated behaviours like drug use and smoking as well. It didn't investigate how things like gender or race might impact healthcare decisions. In her book Fatal Invention, bioethicist Dorothy Roberts laments that Black and Latinx patients in some studies have been shown to be under-prescribed pain relief compared to white patients with similar conditions, and to wait longer for emergency treatment. Although that study I quoted did investigate how subjects view people who have high-fat diets, it didn't investigate how they view fat people specifically. Fat people are discriminated against in employment, in education, and even in court. Being fat is stereotypically associated with being lazy and slow and unintelligent. It's assumed to be your fault, as if A, being fat is a problem, and B, social factors like access to what sorts of diets are available for who just aren't a thing. Sources for all of that in the doobly-doo, and thank you to Kevin Bay on Twitter for introducing me to the world of fat studies. In her book Heavy, communications professor Helen Sugar examines the various ways Anglophone countries talk about fatness and obesity, the contradictions and implications of the various discourses surrounding it, including the ones that lean heavily on personal responsibility, as well as the downright myths and junk science. What she highlights is that these questions defy simple answers, not only or even primarily due to complex and still unfolding science, but because fat and accordingly obesity can only be understood, indeed can only mean anything at all, within the historical and cultural context in which they occur. Intervention in cultural or health issues cannot ever simply be about the facts, whether because those facts are themselves a cultural product, or because the facts are bad. But the flip side of the personal responsibility argument might be that even if we can't tell exactly how responsible somebody is for what, or even whether that idea actually makes sense, I know a freeloader when I see one. And I don't want my tax money going to support somebody who's just going to waste it on self-destructive behaviour. And if that's your stance, then I understand, but I don't really know how to argue with you on that one, because I do want that. I'm okay with my tax money, what little of it there is, admittedly, going to support somebody who is sick, regardless of whether they are responsible for their condition, assuming that idea even makes enough sense to be practically useful, because I just think that healing the sick and helping people is a good thing to do. Even if you aren't religious, and I'm not religious either, there is a reason that people used to think healing the sick was a sign of divine deliverance. It sucks being ill. It consumes everything else in your life. You could be the richest person in the world, but if you don't have your health, you're gonna be miserable. It sucks having to go to hospital. And if I can lessen the amount of time that anybody spends in that situation, then I guess I just think I ought to do that. Part 3. Context and Power. I'm going to use a little bit of postmodernism here, so all you Jordan Peterson fans out there, put your earplugs in now. The French philosopher Michel Foucault said that in the old days, political power used to control the bodies of individual people. It would publicly execute you, or brand you, or torture you if you disobeyed the rules. Nowadays, though, it controls the bodies of groups of people through what he calls biopolitics, which includes things like public standards of hygiene, public vaccination programs, and of course, funding for healthcare. Rather than dealing with the individual, biopolitics deals with the population as political problem. And there's an interesting tension there between the biopolitical standards to which whole populations are held and the often very individualistic personal responsibility angle with which we on the ground are expected to engage with healthcare providers. At its best, this expansion of power into biopolitics